The term trauma-informed care is used a lot, but what actually is it? What constitutes trauma-informed care? Trauma-informed care is an approach to caring for people who've experienced trauma. This channel is all about Tribe Trauma-informed care, which is an approach to caring for children who've had adverse childhood experiences which have led to childhood trauma. So as I explain trauma-informed care, I'm going to explain it from the context of caring for a child who's experienced trauma and use lots of examples that are associated with that type of care.
The children we support have experienced one or more adverse childhood experiences. These are often experiences such as abuse, neglect, domestic violence, or family separation. These experiences will have had an impact on the child. Many children can experience some form of trauma response from those adverse childhood experiences. However, the impact of these experiences can be far wider than the trauma response itself. Other things like childhood development, behaviour, emotional well-being, or the ability to connect and form relationships with others can be impacted. This impact, along with the trauma response itself, is childhood trauma.
The impact of adverse childhood experiences can be vast, and there's way too much to explain in this one video. We have a whole series of videos on adverse childhood experiences and childhood trauma, so if you want to know more, check out that series. It's called the Childhood Trauma series. For children who've experienced trauma, we know there'll be some trauma impact from the trauma experienced. The purpose of trauma-informed care at its core is to take that trauma into account in any care and intervention designed to support the child. Let's look at an example.
Joe grew up in a household where there was domestic abuse between his mum and his dad. His mum and his dad would shout at each other, throw things, and sometimes they would hit each other. There were a few times when this happened when Joe was in the same room and they also shouted at Joe. When this domestic abuse happened, Joe felt scared. He would hide under his bed and wait for the fighting to stop. While hiding, he would worry that his mum would be hurt, as she was smaller than his dad and had been hurt before. Joe also worried that his mum or his dad would come upstairs and shout at him or his sister. While this was happening, Joe's body was on high alert. It was poised for danger and to fight, flee, or freeze at any given moment to keep himself safe.
This is an adverse childhood experience which has resulted in childhood trauma. Joe is fearful for himself, his mum, his dad, and his sister. This trauma has had an impact on him.
Some years pass and Joe no longer lives in an environment where domestic abuse happens, but the lasting effects of this trauma will still be with him. Joe doesn't like loud noises and has real difficulty concentrating in school when anyone shouts or even raises their voice. He can become anxious and worried if he doesn't have a safe space to retreat to. Joe says he feels safest when he knows exactly what's going on around him and when he can be sure that he and his sister will be safe. Sometimes Joe's fidgety behaviour and his inability to concentrate can be interpreted by others as him being disruptive or difficult.
In this example, we can see that Joe's anxious and fidgety behaviour and his inability to concentrate is likely impacted by his trauma history. His history of domestic violence has taught him that when there's loud noises, when there's raised voices, bad things can happen. In those situations, even today, his body primes him to keep himself safe. And in those situations, he's almost unable to concentrate on anything else other than prioritising his own safety. In its true form, trauma-informed care would consider this trauma history and design care and interventions that can support Joe to feel safe. It would be accepting of his difficulties and accepting that he needs additional support.
Trauma-informed care that can support Joe may look very different from typical care. For example, without considering Joe's past, His fidgety behaviour and inability to concentrate when environments are loud or voices are raised is sometimes perceived as him being disruptive or difficult. He could be sent out of class for being disruptive in school, or sent to his room to calm at home. Neither of these actions will actually help Joe, who is on high alert as his body is telling him danger is present. Removing Joe from the loud noises or raised voices might temporarily alleviate the problem, but no action has been taken to help Joe heal or alleviate the anxiety he's feeling. There is also an additional risk of Joe feeling excluded from his peers or rejected from his family at home.
True trauma-informed care means understanding the past history of trauma and how that trauma has impacted on the child. It means understanding the current difficulties because of that trauma and building both of those things into care and interventions that can support the child. They're trauma-informed because they take account of the trauma experienced and the impact that it's had.
Care and interventions that are trauma-informed consider the trauma the child has experienced. They consider the child's current presentation and any difficulties they have due to past trauma or the current context they are in. They build care and interventions using this information that avoid re-traumatization and support the healing process.
Trauma-informed care is not just about knowing the child's trauma history. It's about really understanding what that history has meant to them, how they perceive it, the impact it had on them previously, and the impact it continues to have on them today. If we can understand this, we can really build that into any care and interventions we design to support them. In doing that, we really help with the healing process and tailor any support to meet the child's needs. Here's one final trauma-informed care top tip. A question we're always asked by parents, carers, and those supporting children is, what do you do if you don't know enough information about your child's trauma history? In these situations, what we would say is, if you found out all of the information you can and you don't think you're going to get any more, then work with what you've got. If you know your child has experienced certain things, then try to put yourself in their shoes and consider what that would have meant to them. That can really help us to try and picture the impact that it would have had on the child. If you can do that, that can really help you to provide trauma-informed care. But also remember, there are different types of trauma care where you don't need to know as much information. There's trauma-aware care and trauma-assumed care. We have other videos on that if you want to check out what those types of care are. For more information on childhood trauma and trauma-informed care, subscribe to Tribe, Trauma-Informed Care in Practice.